During a House Oversight Committee hearing in early 2026, Representative Lauren Boebert questioned Minnesota Governor Tim Walz about immigration policies, a massive fraud scheme, and crime victims in his state. The exchange focused on the Feeding Our Future scandal, a federal child nutrition program from which at least $250 million was stolen during the COVID-19 pandemic. According to Boebert's characterization, federal prosecutors have charged nearly 100 individuals across multiple Minnesota fraud schemes, with 85 of those charged being of Somali descent. Boebert questioned whether Walz's administration failed to act on early fraud warnings and whether immigration policies contributed to both the fraud and violent crimes in Minnesota. Walz responded that anyone who commits fraud goes to jail in Minnesota, that the state does not have sanctuary policies, and that immigration vetting is a federal government responsibility. The exchange revealed partisan divisions about immigration enforcement, state versus federal responsibility, and whether demographic data about fraud defendants is relevant to oversight questioning. Watch how Boebert opened her questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to summarize some of the things that have already been said here today rather than ask these questions directly. The federal prosecutors that we have now charged nearly 100 individuals across multiple Minnesota fraud schemes, including Feeding Our Future and related Medicaid, daycare, and autism programs, with 85 of those charged being of Somali descent. Governor Walz, your administration's Department of Education and Department of Human Services failed to act on multiple early fraud warnings about Feeding Our Future, allowing the theft of at least $250 million in federal child nutrition funds that were supposed to feed hungry kids during the COVID-19 pandemic. Governor Walz, I'd like to turn to the demographics and policy choices that enabled this. Since you took office, the Somali population in Minnesota has grown substantially. Recently, Fox 9 reported the reporting puts the total over 107,000. Did your administration's soft on immigration policies, including expanded refugee programs and temporary protected status, contribute to that rapid growth?
I couldn't speak to why people moved to Minnesota, other than it's a great place to live. It could be a sanctuary policy and refugee programs and temporary protected statuses. According to the Center for Immigration Studies analysis of census data, 81% of Minnesota households headed by Somali immigrants receive one or more forms of public assistance, compared to just 21% of native-born Minnesotan households. Why is that disparity so extreme under your watch, sir? I can't speak specifically, Congressman, but I would anticipate that new generation immigrants, whether they be Norwegian or whether they be Hmong or whether they be Somali, probably on the front end as they're establishing home ownership, education.
I think we should be bringing folks to our country that are going to contribute and not just siphon off of the tax dollars of American citizens. Mr. Governor Walz, yes or no, would stricter vetting of immigrants and refugees have prevented many of these fraudsters from entering our country in the first place?
I wouldn't have any way to know that.
Do you agree with stricter vetting processes for those who are coming to our country?
I don't care where you're coming from. If you commit fraud, you're going to jail in Minnesota. That's what I care about, and that's what I'm here for.
Yes or no, should Somali immigrants or any other immigrants who defraud American taxpayers and steal funds intended for hungry children be deported immediately?
That's a decision for the federal government. You're responsible for immigration.
Governor Walz, do you know who Victoria Eileen Harwell is?
I do not believe I do.
What about American Mafalda Tyer?
I don't believe I do.
There. These are Minnesota women who were brutally killed by illegal aliens in your state. You don't know who they are, so I would also assume that you did not attend their vigils or speak out to their families when they were brutally killed by illegal aliens.
I'm not familiar with both of these, no, Congresswoman.
No, just the hard-hitting CNN ones. Yes or no, would you support ending Minnesota's sanctuary policies to stop these fraudsters and murderers from using your state as a safe haven?
Representative Boebert's questioning centered on the Feeding Our Future fraud scandal, one of the largest pandemic relief fraud cases prosecuted by the federal government. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, the scheme involved fraudulent claims for federal child nutrition program funds during COVID-19, with organizers and participants submitting falsified records to obtain reimbursements for meals that were never served. The DOJ's September 2022 indictment charged 47 defendants in connection with the scheme, and subsequent charges brought the total to nearly 100 individuals across multiple related cases. Boebert's statement that 85 of those charged being of Somali descent represents demographic data that could be verified through court records and charging documents. The $250 million figure Boebert cited aligns with DOJ's characterization of the fraud amount. The scheme operated through nonprofit organizations that claim to be feeding children at multiple sites across Minnesota, submitting reimbursement claims to the Minnesota Department of Education, which administered federal funds. Boebert's allegation that Walz's administration failed to act on multiple early fraud warnings references, reporting that state agencies received concerns about Feeding Our Future's operations before federal prosecutors intervened. The Minnesota Department of Education suspended the organization from the food program in 2021 after identifying irregularities, but by that time, according to investigators, substantial fraud had already occurred. Boebert's question about Somali population growth cited Fox 9, reporting of over 107,000 Somali residents in Minnesota. Minnesota has the largest Somali population in the United States, with most concentrated in the Twin Cities metro area. Population growth reflects both refugee resettlement and secondary migration from other U.S. states. The statistic Boebert cited, that 81% of Minnesota households headed by Somali immigrants receive one or more forms of public assistance compared to just 21% of native-born Minnesota households, comes from Center for Immigration Studies analysis of census data. CIS is a research organization that advocates for lower immigration levels. The disparity in public assistance usage reflects multiple factors, including recent arrival, family size, employment patterns, and eligibility for refugee assistance programs. Governor Walz's response that new generation immigrants, whether they be Norwegian or whether they be Hmong or whether they be Somali, probably on the front end as they're establishing homeownership education, characterized higher public assistance rates as typical for recent immigrant populations across different ethnic groups. Historical data shows that first-generation immigrants from various backgrounds have higher public assistance usage rates that typically decline in subsequent generations. Boebert's questions about Victoria Eileen Harwell and American Mafala Tyer reference two Minnesota women who were killed in incidents involving individuals who were in the country illegally. Walz stated he was not familiar with these cases. These cases have been cited by immigration enforcement advocates as examples of crimes that could have been prevented through stricter enforcement. Walz's statement that Minnesota does not have sanctuary policies contradicts characterizations from immigration enforcement advocates, but aligns with his administration's position that Minnesota law does not prohibit cooperation with federal immigration authorities. The term sanctuary is politically contested, with different definitions used by different parties. Watch how Boebert concluded her questioning about cooperation with ICE and marriage fraud.
Well, as I said on June 12th, we don't have sanctuary policies, and Tom Holman reiterated that here in the past few weeks that we do not either, and that we are cooperating as required.
Thank you, Governor. Will you direct local law enforcement to fully cooperate with ICE and federal agents and follow federal immigration laws that are currently on the books?
They do. If they want to do more, they can, but we have a floor that they have to. And that's been proven time and time again in Minnesota over this. That's why they're leaving, because we had cooperated.
Okay. Final question for you, Governor. There are multiple documented reports of Somali immigrants entering sham marriages, including siblings and close family members. solely for immigration purposes. Are you aware of these reports, and what, if anything, has your administration done to stop this kind of immigration fraud happening in your state?
States are not responsible for immigration screening, and I'm not familiar with what you're referencing.
You're not responsible for any vetting whatsoever?
Federal government.
Well, this is happening under your watch, and there's immigration fraud, so we will do everything that we can. And hopefully you allow your local law enforcement officers to coordinate with federal agents when we are going after these immigration fraudsters.
As we do.
Governor.
Thank you, Madam.
Walz's statement that Minnesota law enforcement cooperates with ICE and that we have a floor that they have to references Minnesota's statutory framework for state and local law enforcement interaction with federal immigration authorities. Unlike some jurisdictions that have enacted laws limiting cooperation, Minnesota does not have statewide prohibitions on sharing information with ICE or honoring certain immigration detainers. However, the level of cooperation varies by jurisdiction within Minnesota. Some counties and cities have adopted policies limiting the circumstances under which local law enforcement will hold individuals beyond their release date based solely on ICE detainer requests. These policies have been characterized by some as sanctuary policies, though Walz disputes that characterization. ICE Acting Director Tom Homan, whom Walz referenced, has made statements about cooperation with Minnesota authorities. According to Homan's public comments, Minnesota is among states that cooperate with federal immigration enforcement operations, though he has also criticized certain jurisdictions within the state for policies he characterizes as impediments to enforcement. Boebert's final question about sham marriages, including siblings and close family members, solely for immigration purposes, references allegations of marriage fraud within immigrant communities. Marriage fraud, entering into a marriage for the primary purpose of circumventing immigration laws, is a federal crime investigated by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, and prosecuted by the Department of Justice. Allegations of marriage fraud involving Somali immigrants in Minnesota have been reported, though quantifying the extent of such fraud is difficult without comprehensive federal investigation data. In some cases that have been prosecuted, individuals were charged with providing false information on immigration applications by claiming marriages that were entered into solely for immigration benefits. Walz's response, that states are not responsible for immigration screening, accurately reflects the constitutional and statutory division of authority. Immigration law is federal, and states do not have authority to conduct immigration vetting, determine visa eligibility, or adjudicate immigration status. State agencies that issue marriage licenses verify that applicants meet state marriage requirements, age, lack of existing marriage, but do not investigate immigration intent. Boebert's closing statement, "This is happening under your watch and there's immigration fraud," characterizes the governor as responsible for immigration fraud that occurs in his state, even though federal agencies conduct investigations and prosecutions of such fraud. This represents a partisan disagreement about accountability, whether state executives should be held responsible for federal enforcement gaps or whether such accountability properly rests with federal authorities. The broader question the exchange raises is whether demographic data about fraud defendants, Boebert's emphasis that 85 of nearly 100 are of Somali descent, is relevant to policy discussions, or stigmatizes an entire community based on individual criminal conduct. Somali community leaders in Minnesota condemned the Feeding Our Future fraud and emphasized that fraudulent actors do not represent the broader community. The hearing exchange revealed fundamental disagreements about state versus federal responsibility for immigration enforcement and fraud prevention. Boebert's position, state policies and insufficient cooperation enabled both the Feeding Our Future fraud and violent crimes by individuals in the country illegally. Walz's position, immigration policy is federal. Minnesota cooperates with federal authorities, and criminals face prosecution regardless of status. The Feeding Our Future fraud case remains in federal prosecution, with trials ongoing. Whether state agencies could have prevented more fraud through earlier intervention remains a question for oversight. What remains contested is whether Minnesota's policies contributed to the fraud and crimes Boebert highlighted, or whether these represent federal enforcement failures that would have occurred regardless of state policies. These hearings are public record, but they're often buried in hours of footage most people never see. We break them down, provide context, cite sources, and let you decide what it means. If you believe the public should have access to detailed oversight coverage, not sound bites, but full exchanges, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Transparency requires an audience. Be part of it.